Welcome and thank you for joining us here on Palabra Presents Amplified Voices, and helping us at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists kick off a very special look at Hispanic Heritage Month. Yes, it's kicking off today with the grito, right? Well, I'm Ricardo Sandoval Palos. I'm the managing editor of Palabra, which is the National Association of Hispanic Journalists digital publication platform. And you know what? We're almost at a year now for Palabra. Imagine that. A while back, Alberto said, let's build our own damn table. And here we are, almost 50 original stories later, with more to come as we head into probably one of the most important political seasons of our lifetime. We have more stories coming our way on climate change, on politics and culture and society. So look for more from us in the coming months. But right now, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the most pressing issues, one of the most pressing areas that we might have as far as our own identity as Latinos or Latinx or Chicanos or you name it. And for that, actually looking at how this all fits into the context of this very political year. And we're going to wrap that all into a conversation today that's going to be led by our very own Alberto Mendoza, NAHJ's executive director and founder of Honor 41. And guiding us through all this is author, economist, and director of global migration and demography for the Pew Research Center. Mark is the leader of the center's research on international demographics and immigration, and he's their go-to expert on immigration and the Latino community. So I want to welcome everybody. We're going to leave some time at the end for a great conversation with you all. So line up your questions and have them ready for Alberto. So for now, Alberto, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo. And Mark, it's always a pleasure to see you and great to have you here with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, wonderful. And this is a great way to kick off, but why exactly are we kicking off? Tell us a little bit about just the background on Hispanic Heritage Month, just because we always have people that are joining us and we want to make sure they don't just know, that we share with them exactly what we're talking about.
So Hispanic Heritage Month came out of an effort to recognize the nation's growing Hispanic population, but to tie the recognition to Independence Days, which, by the way, there's many Independence Days that are lined up over the course of the next month that happen for many Latin American countries. Today, for example, 5 Central American countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, for example, they have their Independence Days today. Tomorrow is Mexico and Chile, and there are others to come. So when we talk about Hispanic Heritage Month, initially it was meant to recognize the nation's growing Hispanic population, but it also was tied to these Independence Days because they're all clustered together at a single time. By the way, it was initially just a week. Now it's a month.
Soon it will be the entire year.
We'll have to see.
So the government obviously launched this years ago. I have heard so many times that people resist the word using Hispanic. Then we have Latino, and now we have Latinx. So today's conversation is going to be about identity and the different parts that make us. Tell me a little bit about your experience. And you guys recently did a story on the preference of people using Latinx. Tell me what you're thinking about that, and what did your research find?
Well, as you mentioned the 3 most common pan-ethnic terms that are used to describe what is a very diverse population in the United States. The U.S. has attracted immigrants from all over Latin America and Spain, and in other parts of the world too. But when we think about the population of people who we call Hispanics or Latinos or Latinx, these terms are meant to summarize and have an umbrella term to describe this group's experiences. But that includes everybody who's Dominican or Cuban, or who might be Mexican, might be first generation, or might be third generation, or might even have 5 generations in the United States. Again, it's a very diverse group, and these terms are meant to describe that. But these terms haven't really been embraced by the population they're meant to describe. So, for example, in the past 15 years, we've been asking in our surveys, Hispanic adults, do you have a preference for the term Hispanic or Latino? And we've found that most say they have no preference for either term. What do they prefer? They prefer their country of origin term to the term Hispanic or Latino. And recently, as you noted, we did a report on Latinx. And in that report, we found that only about a quarter of the nation's adult population of people of this heritage actually have heard the term Latinx, and just 3% actually use it to describe themselves. And just to be clear, Latinx is a gender-neutral alternative to the terms Latino and Latina, and it's something that's emerged recently in the last 20 years or so as universities and others have tried to be more inclusive by having terms that are meant to capture not only the diversity of origins, but also the diversity of genders that people might have.
And interestingly enough, it is exactly labels and boxes that a lot of us resist to taking on. And so, as you mentioned, our population as Latinos, Hispanics in the East, Latinos in the West, they don't completely qualify everything that our experience is. And I find that the academia and activism tends to really anchor down around Latinx word more so than other groups. Do you think this is something that's going to be just a trend? Do you think it's going to be adopted, or do you think it'll just remain one of the three in the future?
I think it remains to be seen how awareness of the term will grow, and it's likely to grow as the term becomes more common and used more so. I can tell you that over the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen a adoption of the term by news media organizations. So you start to see it in style guides, for example, and also you see it used by corporations and many celebrities as well. So the term is something that is becoming used more frequently in media, which I think will lead to more awareness of the term, generally speaking. But of course, it's about whether or not people want to use it. Yeah. Even so, I would say one thing that Latinx is a part of is a broader movement that is part of it happening in the US and happening around the world towards making language more gender inclusive. And so here in the US, we not only see the rise of Latinx as a term, but also what pronouns do you use? What gender pronouns do you use to describe yourself? Can you tell me what they are so that I know how to address you? Those movements in the United States are particularly well known and used quite a lot by younger people. So future generations are likely to adopt these more so than older generations, and that's a pattern we see in our data. I would also add Latin America, and in Spain, we're seeing the use of the alternative to Latinx, which is Latin E, because you can actually pronounce that in Spanish. And then also in other countries around the world that have gendered languages, there are other movements to have gender-neutral alternatives. So this is not something I think that's just a trend or a flash in the pan. It's something that I think is emerging, just not sure what form it'll ultimately take.
Yeah, and you mentioned gender-neutral. I think that I do a lot of work with the Latino LGBTQ community, but there isn't a consistent sense that everybody feels that term also really captures the Latino LGBTQ community. So Latinx, LGBTQ, what's been your experience with that and how the LGBT community relates to that term?
Just yet. And that's, we haven't had a chance to observe LGBT's views of Latinx just yet, but that is something that we are looking to do in the future, because you're right, these terms and their awareness and use is a function of many demographic characteristics. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, we find that younger Latinos, 42% of them have heard of the term Latinx. And it's interesting that young Hispanic women are the ones most likely to use it. About 14% use it. But you also see that those who don't have a college degree and those who are immigrants are less likely to be aware of it and to use it. So I think, again, it remains to be seen where it ultimately will go, but it is certainly a third alternative to Hispanic and Latino/Latina.
Well, more labels, and yet, especially when used around this political climate, it doesn't really help continue to define who we are. Another story you guys recently did was just what are the key issues that the Latino community is really looking at as it relates to this election. Two of the key points are the economy and COVID. What do you think is happening right now with Latinos in a way that hasn't happened before around a political time like this?
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure, other than we're all going through the pandemic together. So it's not just a uniquely Hispanic experience, although Hispanics have been perhaps hit harder than others because of a number of things about the jobs they have, the way that they live together in multi-generational households, and then the ease with which the coronavirus and COVID-19 can be, how contagious it is. So there's a lot that I think has been impacting the Hispanic population. But as you noted, our survey showed that for this election, the things that are most important to Hispanics for their presidential vote this year are two things: the economy and the COVID-19 response. I'd add that the third thing is healthcare, and having healthcare as a third issue. That's important because for Latino registered voters, these are the things that they say are going to determine how they vote for president. If you look at the unemployment rate for Latinos this year, one of the things that's striking is that it shot up and was the highest of any large racial or ethnic group in April. It hit over 18%, for example. For Hispanic women, it was 20+%. Now, those numbers have come down. We're now at about 10% unemployment for Latinos, according to the most recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it still remains high and above what was, frankly, a record low in January and February of this year. So just on the economic and pocketbook issues alone, Latinos are feeling that their personal finances are really poor right now. And interestingly, they were saying some of that even before COVID-19. So it's only exacerbated what was already a somewhat downbeat assessment of economics.
Finding that the population of Latinos that are being impacted, is that any real significant difference from the general population?
Yes, it is in terms of unemployment, particularly those who work in hospitality or, for example, in janitorial services. And yet, on the other hand, there are many Latinos who are working in agriculture who have not had to, who have not been let go of their jobs or laid off or furloughed, but instead have been working because they're essential workers. But of course, that's also led to some outbreaks of the coronavirus in those communities across the country. So Latinos have been somewhat more exposed. In terms of the impact health-wise of the coronavirus outbreak, we have been seeing higher infection rates and higher death rates for Latinos than whites, for example, across the country. So for Hispanics, this has been a tough time in many ways, and the virus has taken, in some sense, has had an impact on Latinos because they live in multi-generational households. In fact, one of the things we just recently published is that we've seen an increase in the number of young Americans living with their parents. Now over half do, and that's the highest share we've ever seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. But already young Latinos were living with their parents, 55% prior to the coronavirus outbreak. Now it's at 58%. But those multi-generational households are exactly the type of households that might lead to a spread of the coronavirus if somebody gets sick. So Latinos have been somewhat more exposed in other ways.
Yeah, and I assume that's the case in other countries as well, especially Mexico and other countries where multi-generational living is part of the norm. You don't really leave the house until you have to.
And that's exactly why we see in Latin America, the coronavirus outbreak is actually probably at its worst right now in many Latin American countries. So the U.S. stands out, of course, in a lot of ways, but so does Mexico and Brazil and Argentina and Peru.
Right?
Yes, exactly. The outbreak has been pretty hard on Latin America.
Now, you are an expert also on immigration issues, and normally you hear Latinos are talking about immigration as number one key issue for them. And now we're talking about the economy and COVID, and I'm sure immigration is still up on top of that. Tell me how, this situation, COVID and the economy, are impacting immigration trends, really, especially in the last 6-7 months.
It's had a big impact worldwide is sort of the first key point. Many countries closed their borders and migration worldwide was at a standstill for a couple of months. Slowly started to come back, but it frankly still is very difficult to move from country to country as a migrant just because borders are closed. The other interesting impact here is what's happening in the United States. So in the US, we've seen, for example, naturalizations have been put on hold, or it's taking a lot longer to get your naturalization application approved and reviewed by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services group. And that is important to note because that's an important source of new potential voters for an election, particularly among Latinos. But we've been hearing a lot that applications for naturalization to become a U.S. citizen have somewhat slowed, and it's now looking like many people may not be able to, if not already, have not met the deadlines to become a citizen and therefore be able to register to vote in time for the November election. We'll have to see how things might change, but even the USCIS has had to cut back on its staff because they rely on application fees, and with everything closed, we've been seeing a real slowdown there. So that's another national impact of the COVID-19 downturn.
And another impact that it's having is, of course, on the census, which is extremely important for all of us to be counted. Tell us how that plays out as it relates to statistics, demographics, and how we really can capture the numbers of Latinos in the U.S.
Well, the census, which is done every 10 years, is so important at getting a read on the size of the nation's population and then the important demographic characteristics of it on gender, for example, but also on race and ethnicity. And this is where we get every 10 years our key and very, very important data on how many Latinos live in the country, but also where they live. What's the distribution of the Hispanic population? What states have the biggest numbers? What metro areas? What counties? What census tracts? So an organization like the Pew Research Center depends on a good census count in order to be able to calibrate our survey. So that's one important thing for us as the Pew Research Center. But just generally speaking, the census is so important in other ways, and is actually something of interest to the general public, because the public oftentimes wants to know how it compares, how it looks, and what the nation is like, and it becomes an important resource for future generations to understand where we are today and how we see ourselves. But I think that that's important. The important takeaway here is that, and coming back to labels and so forth, is there are many different ways that people within our population describe themselves, many different labels that they use. The Census Bureau and the census relies on people to self-report that they are Hispanic or Latino. And I think that that's an important thing to take away, because people want to use different terms to describe themselves. There's no single one, but they want to self-identify as well as being part of the population.
Yeah, I think ultimately we know that the numbers are big and they're going to continue to be big. Hopefully people are going to be a part of the census so we can document that. And I think ultimately confirms what we know, that as a Latino population, we continue to grow. NHJ, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, really has been around for 35 years now, and we keep focusing on pushing for diversity, especially for representation of Latinos in media, that the people we're serving look like us. But it's just really, the reality is that the power struggle is real, and there's not a lot of people that are willing to give that up. And my attitude personally has always been, don't wait, just create your own, because it's going to make a difference. And rather than just wait until someone invites you to the party, just throw your own. NHJ recently launched our own cultural competence guide, where we do talk about the different terms. And ultimately, it's about reporting, self-reporting, what is it that you want. We've also just talked about stopping the use of the word minorities. Have you heard more of that discussion as it relates to why that's an important component to, an important word to stop using?
Yes, it actually is something I've been hearing more and more, and I think it's an important point to make, because what makes somebody a minority versus a majority, and also what are the connotations of that? You know, the nation's population is changing so much and has changed a lot over the last 20 or 30 years. And while we might say that, this group is the majority of the population and these other groups do not make up the majority of the population, that's one way you could say it without putting any sort of connotation or judgment, which is where I think some of these labels can start to create a problem. Some people may feel that by calling somebody a minority, you're judging their potential and everything as a result. Now, this is something we haven't explored at Pew Research, so I don't have any hard data to point to, but those are the sorts of conversations that I've heard around terms that people use to describe folks. And it's part of the reason why we see in this country a change in the terms we use to describe ourselves, whether it's about Black American or African American, whether it's about Hispanic or Latino or Latinx. These terms do evolve over time as public sentiments change about what is considered the best way to describe ourselves versus what it was in the past.
The inspiration of the Cultural Competence Guide really stemmed from us meeting with newsrooms who basically put their foot in their mouth and did not talk about our communities in ways that were representative of who we are, often being insulted. And, we have those conversations, but ultimately when that's over, we assume that something registered. So the Cultural Competence Guide was actually made up so we can have a resource for newsrooms that when you don't have any Latinos in the room, or you're the only Latino in the room and you don't feel empowered to be able to really advocate, that you have a resource that an organization like this, like ours, really puts out. And we used over 10, actually in the end, 15 different newsroom leaders to review the terminology, to look at it. It was put together by journalists. Do you think something like this, just really a resource like this, is important for the use all across all different sectors?
I think so. It's something that you'll see many organizations refer to as they are looking to adjust their own style guides. At the Pew Research Center, we're always reviewing the ways in which we describe populations and what are acceptable terms or labels to use to describe groups. We're always reviewing that, oftentimes as we see things change in the news media. So yes, your Cultural Competence Guide, by the way, which I read when you guys put it out, I forget what it was, a month ago or so. It was really great to see all of that in a single place, and helpful for somebody like me who studies this, because it's something that I can point to when people ask me about various labels and identity and the way in which people might use it. But I found it a very, very useful resource. So thank you. Yeah,
you're welcome. And it's going to be something that is what I call a living, breathing document, because we'll have to update it. As we know, terms change, and we've been talking about that today. Labels change, and some things now just aren't acceptable. We will be doing and releasing a Spanish language version either later in the year, early part of the year. We find that especially in Spanish language media, a lot of journalists are coming from other countries, Latin American countries, but the experience of the U.S. Latino is very different than someone who was raised in Colombia. And while their Spanish may be perfect, when it comes to understanding and the nuances of what the stories that they're telling, sometimes those are missteps as well. And so we don't want to keep assuming that people understand who they are talking about and who we are as a people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I find that, yes, you're right, that the ways in which those who are from other countries who come to the U.S. And become even U.S. citizens in the U.S., their experience is a different experience, no matter what country they come from or what part of the population in those countries they come from. The U.S. experience, and being somebody who's born in the U.S. of U.S.-born parents, I have found that, yes, there is a unique experience to growing up here, being of this background and being alive, frankly, at this time when we've had several decades of discussions about what it means to be Chicano or Hispanic, or what civil rights are about. And that's not necessarily something that's happening in other countries around the world. So it is interesting always to me, as a little side note, how much other countries around the world and news media there and politicians make comments about what's happening in the U.S. on race and ethnicity, when those other countries haven't quite had the same conversation, and probably also have even had some difficult moments themselves. But notably, some countries don't even ask on their censuses about race. That's a kind of a uniquely American and Brazilian thing. Mexico has only recently started doing this, but France, people don't get asked about the race because everybody's French. So there's a sense that there is no distinction, even though there are distinctions. And as you know, there have been some troubles around race and immigration in France with regards to opportunity over the years. So it's interesting to me how people characterize these things, but ours is a unique experience in many ways.
We were invited to be speakers at an event, a journalism event conference in Spain last year. And, you know, their concept is, well, kind of, we are the majority. So, you know, what is the role of what we do? And only in having conversations about what our journey has been as NAHJ do they start thinking, oh, wow, with our large migration patterns, we're going to end up with associations of my immigrants who are going to say, hey, where's our voices? Where are we represented? So it kind of surprised them that they hadn't really thought about that. And in Colombia, with the partners that we have at the Gabo Foundation, you know, the issue there is the Afro-Latino, the Colombian Afro-Latinos that say they're not represented in media in Colombia in journalism. So I think to the point is that there is always a lack of a fair representation across the board, even when we know it's an issue.
Yeah, you raise Afro-Latino. I think one thing to point out is that that's yet another identity that some folks may choose to or prefer the most. We've found, for example, that the Census Bureau's race question, which when it asks, are you white, black, Asian American, Native American, or some other race, only about 5 or 4% of U.S. Hispanics say that they're black. But when you ask it in a different way as, are you Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, or Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Cubano, you'll find, for example, that about 25% of Hispanic adults will say that, yes, they are. Same thing applies to mestizo, mestiza, and also are you indigenous? There's much greater shares that identify with those identities. Again, speaking to the diversity of our population, and that many people might have more than one sensibility about their identities and backgrounds. It's not just a single thing.
So because things change, terminology again can vary, what is the best advice for newsrooms and media organizations to really keep up with the trends and really all these changes in a way that isn't 20 years ago?
That is a tough question. But I think one of the key things here is when you're talking to somebody, it's best to let them self-identify themselves. So what do they want to be called? That's, I think, an important question to ask if you're doing any sort of an interview. The second thing I think that's important is that you have to be aware of the current trends and be aware of what it means to select a particular term to describe a population. So as we were talking about earlier, your guide that you've created is a great way to see all the different ways in terms of what they mean to describe this population. But I do wonder if in some parts of the country, like for example in Texas, if Hispanic might be the preferred pan-ethnic term in any news reporting versus say Latinx. But if you're working in California, Latinx or Latino might be a more preferred term than say Hispanic. But being aware of those cultural sensibilities and having available to you the variety of terms that people might use, that takes some work. You have to be aware of what's happening and what the trends are, but you also have to be aware of the context in which you're using those terms. And that's really, I think, where the challenge is understanding the context and then therefore selecting the right term accordingly. But when it comes to people, I'd say the most important thing, and what we try to do in our work at the Pew Research Center, is to let people self-identify. That's exactly how the Census Bureau does it. That's how survey researchers do it. Are you part of this group? And what term do you prefer? Oftentimes, I even let people just tell me. I don't even ask. I just sort of let it roll out because they know who I am and they kind of get a sense. Oh yeah, we did a survey. So, but at some point, I'll hear from them how they see themselves, and that's what I'll use. So,
what do you use personally? How do you identify?
It depends on the context. If I'm abroad in Europe, I will say I'm American. If I'm in Spain, I'll say that I'm Chicano. And they'll ask what that means, or I'll say I'm Hispanic, and then I'll get asked, well, why don't you consider us Hispanic? So that's a little side story on its own. And on the East Coast, most of the time I'll say Hispanic or Mexican. In California, I will typically say, or at a university setting, I might say Latino or Chicano, but it does depend on the context.
Well, you definitely use that wide range. I love it. I always say I'm a Mexican with a Puerto Rican heart because I was born in Mexico, raised in Puerto Rico. It's very rare that I ever use a Mexican American, which is I don't know, it just doesn't roll off of my tongue. Or I use Latino or Latino gay. So it just labels are again what people feel comfortable with. And based on your resounding support, I'm going to ask for a quote in supporting our Cultural Competence Guide as a resource. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about all of this. And I'm excited about sort of where we're going to go as a population. It's interesting to see where the next round of labels and terms will be.
Well, as Ricardo mentioned at the start, we launched Palabra just in November last year. And it just, the idea was that we would do quarterly prints essentially of these stories that impact our Latino communities, really with hiring our freelance members. That now has grown to weekly content, and us realizing that we as Latino journalists can reclaim our narrative and by telling our own stories and not just letting others tell our stories. Yes, they can continue because that's important, but we should not be passive in this front. And so Palabra is that opportunity for us to tell our stories with our voices and not having to decrease our Latino-ness in that storytelling. Why do you think that's important? And that'll be our last question for the morning.
I think that it's important to describe the story of this population because, one, it's a changing story. Two, it's a rich story. And three, it does depend on the origins or the place of the country that we're talking about. It's such a rich tapestry of experiences that are continuing to evolve. One of the challenges I have found in the research world is that oftentimes when we talk about this population, many of the researchers who are doing this work may not necessarily have grown up or been a part of the cultural experience of what it means to be growing up in this space. And so in some sense, I find that it's important to have that cultural competence to understand what you're seeing in the data, to then be able to tell the data stories that go with that without any judgment, just sort of what's happening and how has it come to be. That just alone, I think, is an important skill set. And I see more researchers coming online. I see more journalists coming online who have the cultural competence and the background to speak to what it means to be Latino in the U.S. today. But it's something that I think is always going to be a place where there's room for growth.
Great. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. We will have you back, and because there's so much more to talk about. But really, it's our pleasure for all the work that you do. I wanted to also know a little bit about your own personal story for next time, because you are a role model and an inspiration to a lot of us. And I know that it took a lot of work to get to the position you're at. So thank you on behalf of all of us, Jay and Palabra, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to a future conversation.
Yes, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.